Hallelujah. Good evening. You may be seated. You know, a number of years ago, I had a pastor friend of mine. You know how pastors share different ministry incidences and things. And in fact, Dr. Morocco was talking about, you know, that one time in one of his messages about, I better watch where I'm walking. I wasn't close enough. How he said, you know, can you top this kind of a thing? But this wasn't a situation there. We're just exchanging different crazy things that would go on or some challenges that we would face. And so he was sharing that he was a missionary to the UK. And so for a number of years he was traveling throughout the UK. And just so happened he was preaching at this one service. And so during a prayer time came up, and this gentleman came up, and you know, he's asked him, well, what do you want to pray for? And he says, well, I want the Lord to open up a door for me to be a CEO so that I can get lots of money so that I can give into the kingdom. You know, he was a guy that loved the Lord. He was faithful in the tithe and in offerings. He was faithful to serve in the church. You know, he was a checker at one of the local grocery stores. He was making about 21 pounds sterling silver, which would be equivalent to about $26 USD. Was that bad? No. You know, is it, you know, something to be ashamed of? No. In fact, absolutely not. He was faithful. It was providing for him and his family. But the problem was, the quandary that the pastor friend of mine was in was, how was he going to pray that prayer for God to answer him? You know, because a lot of times we're thinking that, you know, while we express faith and trust, but one of the things that we need to understand is that there is a thing called increasing your personal capacity. You cannot get things done if your capacity is not at the level that it needs to be. So what we see here is that this gentleman is looking to be a CEO. And the truth is, many Christians, you know, don't realize the dreams of employment, marriage, family, you know, the church, that everything is affected by the personal capacity. And so we look throughout the things that, you know, like I said, he was in a quandary, but to increase his capacity, what would this person need to do? Remember, he was a checker making about $55,000 a year, but he wanted to be a CEO, right? That would probably be about $250,000 a year. What's the problem here? Capacity. He didn't have the ability. So my pastor friend was praying, so he asked him, he said, before he prays for God's, you know, open up that door, he prayed that God would give him wisdom. So he asked him, you know, have you had any, you know, management training or any management experience? And he said no. So he just prayed that God would bless him and show him how he could increase his capacity. And then he moved on to the next person. But when we see here, you know, he wasn't, after being expressed about having training or experience, he really didn't want anything to do with that. All he wanted God to do was to bless him. God do all the work, and he received the blessings, and then, you know, release it if he could. But there are certain laws that are in operation that we need to be conscious of, you know. And so we don't realize that many aspects of our life, not only finances, but other aspects of our life, excuse me, may I have that water, please? I didn't bring my bottle of water up. Thank you. Thank you so much. So here he comes, and he's not realizing that his shortfall in having God answer his prayer is that for him to be in that position that he was desiring, there needed to be an increase in his personal capacity. And that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. It's more teaching than preaching. But a few months after we had that conversation, just so happened I came across a magazine that had come in the mail, and it was talking about looking back over the last 15 years on lottery winners, those that had won mega bucks. I mean, millions and millions of dollars. And the stories were very tragic. I mean, very, very sad and tragic, because majority of them, not only did they lose those millions of dollars, you know, in just a few years. It was like the money flew, just flowed through their hands and out. But they ended up getting in greater debt with all those millions of dollars. They got in greater debt than they had prior to winning the lottery. And so, as I was looking at that, what struck me was that the capacity, the ability that we need, ability or capacity could be interchangeable. But our personal capacities, that's why I brought this bucket. In fact, thank you, Michael. If the checker's $55,000 a year was represented in this cup, and he was wanting the CEO's position so that he could bless, and this represents the CEO's income for that position. Now, what's going to happen? I didn't bring water. I was planning to bring water. But what would happen if I would pour into this cup? There would be water all over the place, right? And what would happen if God would answer his prayer on releasing those resources? How could he handle the resources if his capacity was this little cup? There's no way that it could happen. So what is the first thing that he would need to do if he wanted to increase his personal capacity? He needed to try and apply for the management training in his local store and see what opportunities he has so that he can expand his personal capacity so that he gets to the place that one day he could be a CEO, right? But he didn't want to do that. He just wanted the blessings of God and doing it, right? Now, we see here that, what I refer to as capacity thinking. Most people who play and win lotteries, they end up, being average paying jobs. And then when they end up winning the lottery, there has been no shift. There has been no increase in capacity. There has been no increase in ability. So what happens is that they just go through millions of dollars in such a short time, and ends up devastating and ruining their lives because they're worse off than when they started. So we see that the first thing with them is that first they didn't grow in character. All right? Because if you are looking to increase your capacity, one of the things that you need is that your character needs to increase and build up in proportion to what you're desiring God to do in your life. Right? So, and secondly, they didn't grow in the ability or the capacity. There was no desire or no motivation to get trained or find out and get others that were well into the financial arena in how to handle funds. They would need to go and get trained and work so that they can retain it. But all of them, well, most of them, I think it was 90-something% that ended up losing all of it and getting in deeper debt. They didn't do anything to move forward in trying to grow, as I said earlier, in character or in the ability or capacity. But let's look at the same scenario but different people. For example, let's look at Elon Musk or say Michael Jordan. Okay? These are two billionaires. And what would happen if they won the $350 million? Right? Statistically, it would say that they would fail. That somewhere along the line, they would end up losing those millions and millions of dollars. But what is the difference? There are billionaires, and more than likely, they would not fail. In fact, they would take that money and probably double it or triple it. Why? Because they had the personal capacity to handle that kind of money. Right? Otherwise, there's no way they could be handling the billions of dollars that they have. For example, let's talk about Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan is a billionaire. His net worth is $3.2 billion. He ended up his whole illustrious career, and now we're seeing some of these that don't even get close to him, that when they have multiple year contracts are having even more than he had. Do you know that Michael Jordan, in all his years, with all his success, with the 6 championships and stuff, he made $94 million, okay, in his career. When I looked at that, I said, no way. He should have been making hundreds of millions of dollars. But he made $94 million. But with, what we call the big three, it's Hanes, Gatorade, and what is that? In fact, the first one is Nike. I mean, hello, how could I miss Nike? But with Nike, Hanes, and Gatorade, he had $1.8 billion pre-taxed. Okay? But if you add that up, it's, $1.9 billion. Well, he's worth $3.2 billion. So that means that what happened? How did he increase the $1.3 billion that his net worth is now $3.2 million? It's because of personal capacity. He was able to handle all that money because he knew what he was doing. He ended up with experience. He got trained in the areas that he needed. He hired the proper advisors. And all of this comes into play. It's not because we say, oh, yeah, well, I'm believing God for this, and we're expressing faith. And no doubt about it, we need faith. But there's much more that is needed if we're looking to believe God for greater things. We must see that our personal capacity has to increase along the way. When we look at the $350 million in comparison to what the average American's salary is for the year. Okay, the average income in a household is about $75,000. If we look at the capacity of the $350 million that they won in the lottery, compared to the $75,000, the annual income, we would need a container to hold. If a gallon bottle is equivalent to the $75,000, that is the representation of the average income. And then they end up with $350 million. We would need a tank that is 8 feet in diameter. It's 11 feet, 8 inches high, and holds 4,000 gallons. That's just to give you the comparison. 1 gallon is $75,000, and this is, now the capacity for the $350 million. Can you see the discrepancy, why all these resources had gone through them and caused them great pain? And, at one point was elation, and then at the end was great pain and hardship because of it. But Matthew 25 tells us what it is in a pattern to increase our personal capacity. Turn with me to Matthew 25, 14 to 19. For the kingdom of heaven is like a man traveling to a far country, who called his own servants and delivered his goods to them. And to one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, to each according to his own ability. And immediately he went on a journey. Then he who had received 5 talents went and traded with them and made another 5 talents. And likewise, he who had received 2 gained 2 more also. But he who had received 1 went and dug in the ground and hid the Lord's money. After a long time, the Lord of those servants came and settled accounts with them. A couple of months ago, I think Doctor preached the message on the miracle, and he gave the formula. How many remember the formula? Is it on screen? Desire plus faith minus doubt is equal to a miracle. Well, I've got a formula for increasing your personal capacity. My ability or capacity plus my resource plus my stewardship is equal to my personal capacity. The first, we see the answer there in Matthew 25:15a. Is it there? It's a resource. And to one he gave 5, to another he gave 2, to another he gave 1, to each according to his ability. Now, when we see that at first, that as he was distributing the resources, you thought, well, maybe he was showing some favoritism or, some bias or even discrimination. But if we look closely, the answer is there at the end of 52a. It says there, by what? according to their own ability. So it wasn't no discrimination that day. It was no favoritism. What it was according to the resources was released according to their ability or capacity. The second part that we see here in Matthew 25:15b is that ability or capacity was according to their ability. And thirdly, in 25:16 through 18, it's stewardship. Stewardship. He says, stewardship is simple. What will you do with the resources God has given you? Okay, as we look at that passage, it says, then he who had received the 5 talents went and traded with them and made another 5 talents. And likewise, he who received 2 gained 2 more also. But he who had 1 went and dug in the ground and hid his Lord's money. You know, most people, of God's people, pray for increases of resources. How many of us are praying for resources? Praying that God would bless us and release us. I mean, daily prayer meetings, we're praying that God would release resources in Kings so that we can do all the things that we do. We also pray for our congregation, that God will prosper them and that they would increase and get promotions and all the other things. But a lot of times we miss about the aspect of personal capacity, because as we're praying for resources, what happens is that we need to pray, for increase in capacity and good stewardship. Because if we're praying just for resources, then the resources are released only according to your capacity or ability. So if you're not growing in your capacity, if you're not increasing your capacity or your ability, then he won't release the resources to you, because it'll be wasted, because you're not being able to handle properly. And handling is what? Stewardship. So as we see here, the stewardship is a key, because it's stewardship that actually gives you the increase of capacity. See, what we steward and how we steward is so important, that as we look at the rest of the passage, we see when I'm sorry, it kind of wiped out on my phone. Can we have the rest from 20 to 30? 25? Okay, it's not. So let me search it. I'm so sorry. My phone just kicked out from its position. Let me say, from 20 to 30, the Lord comes back after his long journey. And the one with 5 talents comes to him and says, Lord, you had given me 5 talents, and look, I increased it by 5. He said, well done. He said, enter into the joys of the Lord. The next one with 2. Well, I had 2. And I gained 2 more. He said, well done. Come in to the joys of the Lord. Then the one that hid it, what did he call him? He called him wicked and, okay, it's on, Bless God. Thank you. It says, he said that you're not sown and gathered, but what was his motivation there? If you look down in the next verse, he says, because I was fearful. I was fearful. And there's a lot of times that we end up, that we become fearful of increasing our ability or capacity because of past circumstances by which we know that the master was a hard driver. That's his mindset, okay, the one with the one. But if you think about it, why did the master give him one? Because his ability or capacity was minimal, right? That's why he gave him one. He wasn't going to give him 5, or he wasn't going to give him 2, because his capacity was not where it needed to be. So what happens here is that we see that the steward is a key in increasing our capacity. So what should we be doing? Continuing to pray for increase in capacity and increase in stewardship, that we would be better stewards, that God would give us wisdom in how we would be stewarding the things that we have, that we would prioritize the various things that we needed to do so that we were not wasting our investment and wasting funds and putting it in areas that were a priority. So in closing, Matthew 25, really we find the ability came first. You had the ability or the capacity that came first. Then the resource followed. But too many times in the church, we're praying for the resources and not praying for the capacity. So what happens is that we're putting the cart before the horse, right? Because what we're doing is we're just looking for the resource. But this passage shows clearly that the resource came according to the ability, right? It's the ability, then the resource, and then stewardship. And when we are good stewards, then our capacities increase, and therefore God can pour more into us because we've, got a larger container that we can contain that which God has entrusted to us. And we will not, if we are not looking at stewardship, then we will find that God will not be able to entrust us with the things that he wants to, because God wants to bless us and not withhold from us. But God is not going to just, release resources that he cannot entrust to us. So that we need to be in a place by which we are growing in character, and growing in capacity or ability. And so we're looking at the resources and the abilities. So if we put it in the right perspective, when our abilities or your abilities and then your resources are given proper stewardship, then your increase in capacity will come in naturally. Are you hearing me? Ability, capacity, right? The resources will be released when stewardship is applied. So how many desire to increase your capacity? Okay? If you want to increase your capacity, How are you going to pray? Pray that you would be a good steward with the resources that God gives you. Because when you become a good steward of the resources God is giving you, what happens is that as you increase in your capacity with the stewardship, God can entrust more to you. He's going to be willing to release more to you.